Algebra 1, Sensei Learning System, Lesson 2. Adding and multiplying variables. If we're adding variables, we're concerned about the coefficients. With the coefficients here, this is a single x, the coefficient is 1, so I want to place a 1 next to all x's. Now that we have a coefficient of 1 for all the x's, we can add them. It's a total of 5, and so we have a coefficient of 5x. When multiplying x's, we concern ourselves with the powers. So this is a first power, first, and first power. So in multiplication, we worry about the powers, we collect those. And so we end up with x to the 5th power. Okay, number 3 here. Well, again, we're adding x's, so we concern ourselves with coefficients. So the coefficient here is 4, 2, and the coefficient here is 1. So when we collect them, 4, 6, plus 1 more, 7. We get 7 x's. Here we're multiplying x's, so we concern ourselves with the powers. So this is x to the 4th times x to the 2nd times, this is x to the 1st here. And then we add the powers here, and we get x to the 7th power. Okay, once again, we're adding and subtracting variables, so we concern ourselves not with the powers, but, I'm sorry, the power wasn't ever supposed to be there. So we got 4. Coefficient. Sorry about that. So we look at the coefficients. So 4 take away 2 is 2, plus 1 more makes 3 x's. Okay, here we're multiplying variables. So we concern ourselves with the powers. This is the first power. So 4th power, a negative 2nd power is 2, plus 1 more power makes 3. So this is x to the 3rd power. And once again here, we have x to the negative 4th power times x to the 2nd power times x to the 2nd power times x to the 1st power. Then we put these together. 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 take away 4, 0, plus 1 more is 5. Or I can just say these add up to 5, and take away 4 gives us x to the 1st power. And x to the 1st power is understood, so it could be written like this as well. Okay, for this one, we have 5 to the 2nd power. This we're going to start off with expansion here because there's no negatives. So we'll have, this becomes 5 times 5. That's your expansion. Once you have your expansion, you can go to your final answer, 5 times 5, and that's 25. Okay, here we have a negative 5 in the 2nd power. At the beginning, we focus on the negative. We convert that to a negative 1. So it becomes a negative 1 in parentheses times 5 to the 2nd power. Then from there, the next step we'll do is expansion. Since there's this is 5 to the 2nd power, you notice that only the 5 here is under the 2. Not that the 1 is protected. The negative 1 is protected. So this becomes negative 1 times 5, and that's what negative 5 to the 2nd power actually means. Negative 1 times 5 times 5. So 5 times 5 is 25, and we have a negative times a positive, which is negative. Here our negative is in the power range. So how we handle negative on the power is differently how we handle negative as a coefficient. The negative converts this into a reciprocal. So the base becomes a reciprocal. So you get 1/5 to the 2nd power. Then after the reciprocal is done, there's no more negatives, and so we're simply dealing with 2nd power. So we deal with expansion now. This becomes 1/5 times 1/5. And 1/5 times 1/5, the expansion becomes 1 over 25. Here on 4, we have 2 negatives, a negative here on the 5 and a negative here on the 2. So we'll do the negative on the outside first. This gets converted to a negative 1. And 5 to the negative 2nd power. Okay, next we deal with this negative right here. This negative does not convert to a negative 1, but instead it becomes a reciprocal, or we get the reciprocal of the base. So this becomes negative 1 times 1/5 raised to the positive 2nd power. Okay. So now we've dealt with the first negative here, and we dealt with the second negative here. So there's no more negatives to deal with. Now what's left is expansion. So this becomes negative 1 times 1/5 times 1/5. And this is actually what this means right here. Negative 1 times 1/5 times 1/5. And when we multiply those, we're going to get a negative times a positive, which is negative, over 1 over 25. Okay. Here we have 2 negatives again, but this negative is being protected inside a parentheses. This means we cannot actually change this to a negative 1 because the negative is inside. That means we cannot change it. We cannot get a hold of it. So instead of starting off with this negative, we'll go ahead and bypass this and start with this negative. That means we'll take a reciprocal of the base, which is negative 1 over 5 and second power. And now that the exponent no longer has a negative on it, we can now do expansion. The expansion of this will be negative 1/5 times negative 1/5. And this is the expansion or the definition of what this means right here. Negative 1/5 times negative 1/5 is going to be positive 1 over 25, because a negative times a negative is a positive. Number 6. Number 6, we have a negative on the outside, a negative on the inside, and a negative here on the exponent. We'll start off with the negative on the outside, which converts to a negative 1. Next, the negative on the inside is still protected by the parenthesis, so we can't change that at all, so we'll skip this negative right here and go to this negative on the power. So this negative on the power is going to convert the base into a exponent, so negative 1 times the negative 1/5 to the positive second power. Okay, so the negative here is removed, so now we can do expansion. So we have a negative 1 times negative 1/5 times negative 1/5. And so this is the actual representation of this right here. So a negative times a negative times a negative will give us negative, and a 1 times 1/5 times 1/5 will give us 1 over 25. So the final answer is negative 1/25. Okay. All right. So once again, what we have here is a 4 to the third power, so we're going to use expansion. So this becomes 4 times 4 times 4. And 4 times 4 is 16, and 16 times 4 is 64. Here we have a negative 4 on the outside, or negative, should I say, on the outside. So this becomes a negative 1 times 4 to the third power. And then from there, we can do our expansion now that the negative has been converted to a negative 1. So we have negative 1 times 4 times 4 times 4. There's our expansion. And so we have 1 times 4 times 4 times 4, which is negative 64, because negative times positive times positive times positive is negative. Now we have a negative here on the exponent. That means that we have to convert the base to a reciprocal. So this will be 1 over 4 raised to the third power. Then we're going to use expansion. So expanding this, we get 1 over 4 times 1 over 4 times 1 over 4. After expansion, we have 1 times 1 times 1, which the numerator is 1, and 4 times 4 times 4, which is 64, and that's our denominator. Okay, here we have a negative here on the outside and a negative here on the exponent. So we'll deal with this negative here first. This becomes a negative 1 times 4 to the negative third power. Then from there, we're going to take this negative here and take the reciprocal of the base. So this becomes a negative 1 times 1/4 to the positive third power. Now from there, we can expand the base here, and we'll get negative 1 times 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4. So what we get is a negative times a positive times a positive times a positive, which is a negative. And we get 4 times 4 times 4 on the bottom, which is 64, and 1 times 1 times 1 on top, which is 1. On number 11, we have a negative 4 raised to a negative third power. This negative is protected, so we cannot change this negative here to a negative 1. So instead, we change this negative here to positive and take the reciprocal of the base. So this becomes a negative 1/4 raised to the third power. Now we'll do our expansion. So this becomes negative 1/4 times negative 1/4 times negative 1/4. So a negative times a negative times a negative, right down here, will be a negative. And 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. Okay, here we have negatives on the outside, inside, and on the exponent. We'll deal with this negative first. So this is interpreted as a negative 1 times negative 4 to the negative third power. This negative 4, or this negative on the 4, cannot be changed because it's within the parenthesis. Parenthesis protects it. So we'll go to this negative right here, which is on the exponent, and take a reciprocal. So this becomes negative 1 times negative 1/4 raised to the third power. Now we have a positive exponent, and we can use this for expansion of the base. So this becomes negative 1 times negative 1/4 times negative 1/4 times negative 1/4. Okay. So a negative times a negative times a negative times a negative, 4 negatives, is a positive. And then 1 times 1 times 1 times 1, that's a 1 for the numerator, and 4 times 4 times 4 for the denominator is 64. So positive 1 over 64.